Room 12 felt cold. Sarah's hands trembled. The key wouldn't turn. Behind her, baby Grace whimpered in the carrier. The divorce papers crinkled in Sarah's jacket pocket as she finally managed to open the door. 26 years old, and this was what her life had become. A cheap motel room that smelled like stale cigarettes and broken promises. The man next door was singing, soft, gentle humming, through paper-thin walls. An old song she couldn't quite place. Sarah paused, listening to the melody as she set Grace's carrier on the worn bedspread. Something about the tune made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Who sings lullabies at 11 p.m. in a place like this? She pressed her ear against the wall, curious despite herself. The singing stopped abruptly, as if he'd sensed her listening. Footsteps shuffled across the floor next door. Then silence. Sarah pulled back, feeling foolish. Here she was, a newly divorced mother with $37 to her name, eavesdropping on strangers. Grace started crying then, that hungry wail that pierced straight through Sarah's already frayed nerves. She fumbled for the formula in her diaper bag, hands shaking as she mixed the powder with lukewarm tap water from the bathroom sink. The mirror showed her reflection, blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under green eyes, wearing the same jeans and blue sweater she'd thrown on that morning when the judge's gavel had fallen. "It's okay, baby girl," she whispered, testing the formula temperature on her wrist. "We're going to be okay." But even as she said it, Sarah wasn't sure she believed it herself. The singing started again next door, clearer this time. "You Are My Sunshine," her grandmother's favorite song. Sarah's eyes welled up as she fed Grace, remembering Sunday mornings in Grandma Ruth's kitchen, the smell of pancakes and the sound of that same melody drifting from the old radio on the windowsill. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah froze, bottle halfway to Grace's mouth. Who could be knocking at this hour? Through the peephole, she saw a man in his early 40s standing in the hallway, dark hair with streaks of silver, wearing a rumpled flannel shirt and jeans. His face looked kind but tired, whether in a way that spoke of someone who'd seen his share of hard times. "Ma'am." His voice was gentle, careful. "I heard the baby crying. I don't mean to intrude, but do you need anything? Formula? Diapers? I've got some supplies in my room." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her not to open the door to a stranger, especially not here, not now. But something in his voice, the genuine concern, the way he'd offered help without expecting anything in return, made her reconsider. "I'm sorry," she called through the door, Grace still fussing in her arms. I can't." "It's okay," he said quickly. "I understand. I'm Jake, by the way, Jake Morrison, room 13. If you change your mind, I'll be right next door." She heard his footsteps retreating, then the sound of his door closing softly. Sarah sank onto the bed, Grace finally settling as she took the bottle. The kindness in the stranger's voice had caught her completely off guard. When was the last time someone had offered to help without wanting something in return? The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of children playing outside. She'd slept fitfully, jerking awake every time Grace stirred, hyper-aware of every creak and sound in the unfamiliar room. Pulling back the faded curtains, she saw a small playground behind the motel, rusty swings and a slide that had seen better days, but clean enough. A few kids were already there, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Grace cooed from her carrier, tiny hands reaching for the sunlight streaming through the window. Sarah's heart ached as she looked at her daughter's innocent face. This wasn't the life she'd planned. She'd dreamed of a house with a white picket fence, family dinners, bedtime stories in a nursery painted soft pink. Instead, they were living in a motel room with mysterious neighbors and an uncertain future. A gentle knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. This time, when she looked through the peephole, she saw Jake standing there with a brown paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning," he said when she cracked the door open. "I brought breakfast from the diner down the street. And coffee. You look like someone who could use coffee." Sarah wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence, but the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries made her stomach growl audibly. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, too nervous about the divorce proceedings to keep anything down. "I can't pay you back right now," she admitted, opening the door wider. Jake smiled, lines crinkling around brown eyes that held genuine warmth. "Did I ask you to?" He set the bag on the small table by the window and handed her one of the coffees. "Cream and sugar on the side. Wasn't sure how you'd take it." "Black is fine," Sarah said, inhaling the rich aroma gratefully. "Thank you. Really. I'm Sarah, by the way, and this is Grace." "Beautiful baby," Jake said, his expression softening as he looked at Grace. "She's got your eyes." There was something wistful in his voice, a sadness that Sarah recognized because she'd been carrying it herself for months. "Do you have children?" she asked gently. Jake's smile faltered for just a moment. "Had," he said quietly. "But that's a story for another time." The weight of that single word, "had," settled between them like a stone dropped in still water. Sarah felt a chill run through her, understanding instinctively that Jake carried a loss far greater than divorce papers and broken dreams. Over the next 3 days, an unlikely friendship began to bloom between rooms 12 and 13. Jake would knock each morning with coffee and whatever breakfast he'd picked up from the diner. He never asked intrusive questions about why Sarah was there, never pushed for information she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he listened when she needed to talk and provided comfortable silence when words weren't necessary. On the 4th day, Sarah learned that Jake worked construction, had been staying at the motel while renovating houses in the area. His hands were calloused and paint-stained, but gentle when he offered to hold Grace while Sarah showered or ate. He sang to the baby in a voice that was rough around the edges but filled with tenderness, the same lullaby Sarah had heard through the walls that first night. "You're good with her," Sarah observed one afternoon as Jake bounced Grace on his knee while she played peekaboo behind her tiny hands. "Kids are easy," Jake said with a sad smile. "It's adults who complicate everything." That evening, as Sarah was giving Grace a bath in the motel's tiny bathroom, she heard raised voices from outside. Through the window, she saw a police car in the parking lot and 2 officers talking to the motel manager. Her blood ran cold when she heard them mention room 13. She wrapped Grace in a towel and listened at the door. The voices were clearer now, and what she heard made her sink onto bed in shock. Been looking for him for 6 months. Left the scene after the accident. His own daughter. Sarah's hands shook as the pieces fell into place. Jake's sadness when she'd asked about children. The way he'd said had instead of have. The pain in his eyes when he held Grace. The voices moved away, and Sarah heard Jake's door open and close. She sat frozen for what felt like hours, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms, trying to process what she'd overheard. Was Jake a criminal? Had he hurt someone? Everything she thought she knew about him suddenly felt uncertain. But then she remembered the gentleness in his voice, the way he'd offered help without expecting anything in return, the tears she'd sometimes caught him wiping away when he thought she wasn't looking. A soft knock came at her door. Sarah's heart hammered as she looked through the peephole. Jake stood there, shoulders slumped, looking older than his years. "Sarah," his voice was barely above a whisper. Could we talk?" Against every instinct screaming at her to stay silent, to pretend she wasn't there, Sarah opened the door. Jake's eyes were red-rimmed, his face etched with a pain so deep it took her breath away. "You heard," he said simply. Sarah nodded, clutching Grace closer. "The police?" "Yeah." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "I figured they'd find me eventually." "What happened, Jake?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Jake closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Sarah saw a man drowning in guilt and grief. "My daughter, Lily. She was 7. Beautiful, smart, full of life. Her mother, my ex-wife, she had primary custody, but I got weekends." He paused, struggling with the words. "That day, 6 months ago, I was supposed to pick Lily up for our weekend together. I'd been working double shifts, trying to save money for a better place, so maybe I could get joint custody. I was exhausted, running late, and His voice broke. "I ran a red light. Didn't see the other car until it was too late. The impact, Lily was in the passenger seat. She died instantly. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the full horror of Jake's confession sank in. "Oh, Jake, I killed my own daughter," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "And then I ran, like a coward, left the scene, left the other driver hurt, left everything behind because I couldn't face what I'd done." The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief and guilt. Sarah found herself thinking about Grace, about the fierce love she already felt for her daughter, about how devastating it would be to lose her, let alone to be responsible for that loss. "Why didn't you turn yourself in?" she asked gently. Jake's laugh was bitter. "Because I'm a coward. Because facing the consequences meant admitting it really happened. Because every day I stayed free was one more day I could pretend Lily was still out there somewhere, still singing along to the radio, still asking me to push her higher on the swings." He looked at Grace sleeping in Sarah's arms, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "Seeing you with her, it's been torture and blessing all at once. Torture because it reminds me of everything I lost, everything I destroyed. But blessing because for just a few minutes each day, I could remember what it felt like to love a child, to want to protect them from a world." Sarah felt her heart breaking for this broken man who'd shown her nothing but kindness even while drowning in his own guilt. "Jake, you have to turn yourself in." "I know." He nodded slowly. "I called them after I heard the officers leave. They're coming back in the morning. What will happen to you? Prison, probably. Vehicular manslaughter. Leaving the scene of an accident. Maybe more charges. I deserve whatever they give me." Sarah shifted Grace to one arm and reached out, touching Jake's hand gently. "You made a terrible mistake, but these past few days, the kindness you've shown us, that's who you really are." Jake squeezed her hand gratefully. "Thank you for saying that. But kindness doesn't bring back the dead." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about justice and mercy, about the complexity of human nature, about how someone could be both guilty of something unforgivable and still capable of genuine goodness. She thought about her own struggles, her own mistakes, and how Jake's simple act of kindness had been a lifeline during her darkest hours. In the morning, she watched through her window as Jake walked out to meet the police officers who'd come to arrest him. He moved with quiet dignity, hands raised, no resistance. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back toward her room and mouthed, "Thank you." Sarah spent the rest of the day making phone calls, using what little battery she had left on her phone to track down information about Jake's case, about the other driver he'd left injured, about Lily's mother. She learned that the other driver had recovered fully, that charges had been filed, but Jake's location had remained unknown. She learned that Lily's mother had started a foundation in her daughter's memory, advocating for safer intersections and supporting families affected by traffic accidents. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week ago. She packed up her meager belongings, strapped Grace into her carrier, and drove to the county jail. "I'm here to see Jake Morrison," she told the desk sergeant. Jake looked surprised and grateful when they brought him out to the visitor area. He wore an orange jumpsuit now, but his eyes held something they hadn't before, a kind of peace. "You didn't have to come," he said, picking up the phone on his side of the glass partition. "Yes, I did." Sarah adjusted Grace on her lap. "I wanted you to know that your kindness mattered, that these past few days when I felt like I had nothing, you reminded me that there are still good people in the world." Jake's eyes filled with tears. "Sarah, I also want to tell you that I reached out to Lily's mother. To Elena." Jake went very still. "You what?" "I told her about the man you've been these past few days, about how you helped a stranger and her baby when you were drowning in your own grief, about how you turned yourself in because it was the right thing to do." "What did she say?" Jake's voice was barely audible. Sarah hesitated, then forged ahead. "She said she's not ready to forgive you yet. Maybe she never will be. But she said knowing that you're capable of kindness, that you haven't forgotten how to love, gives her hope that Lily's death might somehow lead to something meaningful." Jake buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "She's agreed to write a letter to the judge," Sarah continued, "not asking for leniency exactly, but asking that your capacity for good be considered alongside your guilt. And Jake, she wants to meet with you when you're ready. She has things to say about Lily, memories she wants to share with someone who loved her as much as she did. When Jake finally looked up, his face was streaked with tears, but somehow lighter than Sarah had ever seen it. Why would you? Because kindness creates kindness, Sarah said simply. Because you showed me that even in our worst moments, we can choose to help each other. Because Lily deserves to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a little girl whose father loved her enough to finally face the truth. Over the following months, Sarah rebuilt her life slowly but surely. She found a job at a local daycare center, enrolled in night classes to finish her degree, and moved into a small apartment where Grace could have her own room. She wrote letters to Jake regularly, updating him on Grace's milestones and her own progress. Jake pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the letters he received from Sarah, and eventually from Elena, and from other people whose lives he touched during his months of running, reminded him that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. 3 years later, Sarah stood outside the prison gates with Grace, now a chattering 3-year-old with pigtails and a bright yellow dress. Jake emerged looking older, but somehow more solid, more at peace with himself. The first person to greet him was Elena, Lily's mother, who had become an unexpected source of strength and healing for both of them. "Uncle Jake." Grace ran toward him on wobbly legs, a name she'd learned from Sarah's stories and the pictures they'd sent. Jake knelt down and scooped her up, tears streaming freely down his face. "Hi there, little sunshine," he whispered, using the nickname that had started with late-night lullabies in a cheap motel. Sarah watched as Jake was surrounded by the small community of people who had chosen to believe in second chances. Elena, who had channeled her grief into advocacy and found unexpected healing and forgiveness. Marcus, Jake's former construction supervisor who had held his job open, and Father Rodriguez from the prison ministry, who had become a mentor and friend. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked Jake as the group began walking toward the cars. Jake looked back at the prison, then at the faces of the people who had chosen to stand by him through his journey toward redemption. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I finally am." As they drove away, Grace fell asleep against Jake's shoulder, and Sarah caught his reflection in the rear-view mirror. The man she'd met in that motel had been drowning in guilt and running from his past. The man sitting behind her now carried the same grief, the same regret, but he also carried hope. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as she turned onto the highway that would take them all toward their new beginning, the greatest acts of kindness come from the most broken places. And sometimes, the strangers who appear in our darkest hours aren't there to save us. They're there to remind us that we all have the power to save each other. The Sunset Motel was still there, still faded and worn, but as they passed on their way to Jake's halfway house, Sarah noticed something new. A small playground behind the building where children's laughter rang out bright and clear, a testament to the truth that even in the cheapest places, hope could still take root and grow.